Welcome back. This is another episode of the Black Fathers podcast series, which is a collection of 12 conversations covering a spectrum of intricately connected topics related to Black fatherhood. I am Dr. Alvin Thomas, assistant professor in the School of Human Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Probably the two most intimate or intricate roles that we think of when we think of fatherhood is that of provider and protector. And until recently, our families and our society viewed these roles kind of very narrowly. A man who cannot provide financially for his family, and one who could not protect his spouse and children from outside dangers was no man at all. And more men are beginning to describe their manhood in terms of their ability to take care of their children and their family. These roles, therefore, are even more important today than ever. In today's conversation, we will explore how the role of provider and protector are being reimagined. Joining me in discussing this topic of reimagining the role of provider and protector for Black men is Morris V. Russell Professor of Social Policy and Social Work Practice and Director of the Center of Research on Fathers, Children, and Family Well-Being, and a co-PI for the ongoing internationally renowned longitudinal Fragile Families Study, Dr. Ronald Mincy. Joining us also is Dr. Maria Johnson, scholar, philanthropist, author, and founder of the Black Women and Girls Fund, whose work focuses on inequalities in race, gender, family, and policy. Greetings to you all.
Hello.
Greetings. Good morning.
Happy to be here.
Thank you very much, both of you, for agreeing to join us for this conversation. Each of you, please take a couple of minutes to say a little bit more about your work and what you do, specifically in reference to Black fathers. Go ahead, briefly introduce yourselves.
Maria, please.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm so excited to be here and about this topic of conversation. So as it relates to fatherhood, I like to think about the work and research I do really hitting on three areas. One is thinking more deeply about culture. And by culture, I mean how people make sense of the world, their knowledge, their worldviews, how people represent themselves. So thinking about how the culture of fatherhood exists in the United States and the various ways that culture may influence how Black men and families think about and do parenting. Related to that, another aspect of fatherhood and Black fatherhood in particular that I look at is this notion of conduct, which is how people do fatherhood and the behaviors related to fatherhood. And so things like, do fathers put diapers on children? Do they dress their children? How they may read or engage their children. So thinking about the ways that men perform, behave, and engage within families. And the third aspect is related to where and how do we get this information about Black fathers? Do we interview Black men about fatherhood? Do we collect information from mothers and children? And thinking deeply about who collects the information, how it's collected, and the sources of information may shape what we know about fatherhood and in the ways that identifying alternative or diverse sources of information may help us expand our ideas about fatherhood and ways to think about it. And so I've done that through my research and writing, but also through some of my administrative work.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Johnson. Dr. Mincy.
Well, again, good morning. It's really good to be here. My work related to fatherhood really began with a focus on public policy. I was very interested in, picking up from Dr. Johnson's comments, ways in which African-American families, their structure, and the challenges and opportunities that African American parents face, how they are different from the norms of parenting and fatherhood among whites, and how that difference makes public policies as they affect fathers just and mothers and children just so radically different. And I was really interested in the large number of non-resident fathers who are African American in the United States, and the ways in which the differences between the ways Blacks and whites do fatherhood, and how that makes the child support enforcement system particularly egregious for African American fathers and the mothers of their children and their children. And so my work over the last 30 some odd years has been about trying to understand really how the child support enforcement system understands itself, what it thinks its goals are, and then trying to provide a variety of stakeholders in that system with information about how the way we do child support enforcement in the United States poorly meshes with the ways in which African Americans do family, and then try to persuade child support enforcement that there is need for reform in order to support African American fathers so that they can play a bigger role in the lives of their children and families. And subsequently, then morphed in thinking about other things, as I've learned from colleagues, from a focus on fathers to really a focus on child development, and trying to understand the role that fathers play in children's development, and how particularly the role that non-resident fathers can play, because such a large portion of African American men are non-resident fathers, continuing to think about the role that they can play in their children's development, even though they don't live together. And then trying to dispel lots of myths that are associated with this notion. In American family literature, there is this notion that families live under the same roof. And there are many African American families where mothers and fathers don't live under the same roof, but they are still trying their absolute best to parent their children together. And so my work has been about trying to dispel or broaden the notion of family so that it can incorporate non-resident fathers, mothers, and their children, and then figure out still how to be supportive of both parents being engaged in the lives of their children.
Excellent. I think we have really great expertise on this panel. So doctors, let's jump right into it. What does it mean to protect and provide as a man and a father? And where are the roles of protector and provider most relevant for Black fathers?
When I hear that question, the first things that come to mind are really societal expectations, traditional societal expectations around fathers, and they're really aligned with what you mentioned at the beginning, the introduction of the podcast. This idea is that fathers physically protect their partners and their children. And when I say partners and children, the traditional kind of societal expectations are really kind of a cisgendered heterosexual relationship, right? Men protecting women, romantic partners, usually married, and protecting their children. And a lot of my research on fatherhood has also related to daughter-father relationships. So when society thinks about daughter-father relationships, it's often from a perspective of fathers protecting their daughters within romantic dating relationships, protecting them from harm. And the other traditional aspect of that related to societal expectations and providing is the idea of fathers providing financially and providing material resources. I think the limitation of those perspectives is that oftentimes, due to historical as well as the contemporary kind of socioeconomic structures of U.S. society, is that Black men haven't always been able to obtain the jobs and resources that would allow them to provide in more traditional manners. On top of that, Black families have just had more societal structures, as well as just the ways that families operate. Black families haven't always operated in this traditional father as the breadwinner in the household and mother within the household making less money norm. And in general, and I know Dr. Mincy will speak more about this, but families are changing and women are increasingly becoming primary financial caregivers and families. And so I think it's important for us to take expanded approaches to thinking about the provider role and the protector role, and really taking a child-centered approach. So when people are talking about providing the provider role and the protector role, to say, well, what do children need in order to feel safe, protected financially, emotionally, psychologically? And those are the things that parents, whether they're fathers, mothers, caregivers of any sort, grandparents, those are the things that they must do in order to help their children. And when we're thinking about Black fathers in particular and these roles, I think it's important to keep in mind that there are so many different types of Black fathers. There's social fathers, there's coaches and mentors, there's uncles, there's grandfathers, there are biological fathers, there are legal caregivers, and their approaches to protecting and providing in expanded ways may differ based on how they're positioned with the children inside and outside of the household, or their relationships with other caregivers within the children's family circle.
So it's fascinating, Dr. Johnson, because I think this really is an important question. I'll just pick up on one of the points and see where it goes. So in the first place, Black women have had very high rates of labor force participation for decades. And so the idea of the man being the primary breadwinner in the home is just fundamentally inapplicable to families of color, but particularly to African American families, because the idea that mothers stay primarily in the home while fathers are working, that is a 1950s and prior norm, but among whites, but it hasn't been the case among African American families. Both mothers and fathers were breadwinners, and in many ways, the role of African American women in the labor market was much more secure than the role of African American men in the labor market. So there's and this is important in so many ways. The researcher Bruce Western talks about, who's a scholar on mass incarceration. He talks about how over time we've experienced that sort of policies that promoted mass incarceration way back in the 1980s were essentially a revenge on the part of the larger white society for the victories won in the civil rights movement. And he talks about how the notion of law and order and mass incarceration was really promulgated across the political spectrum in state and local and then in national governments, because conservatives really thought that the civil rights movement had gone too far. And one way to pull back the African American community was to continue the process of incarceration of Black men that had been a consequence of slavery and Reconstruction and the other. So I think the idea of, again, Black men being the primary breadwinners is in the family has not been, in our American experience, just denies that. And as a result, but the views of the larger society, African Americans really are part of the larger society. And so it's that conflict between the norms of the larger society on the one hand and how Black families operate on the other that creates lots of stresses for families in general and Black men in those families in particular. And what I am concerned about is how Black families can make adaptations to these norms in such a way that we follow the norms helpful for us and for our children and ignore the norms that are not. And so, but I do worry that in trying to parse out what is helpful about those norms, that is the norms of the larger society, and what is not helpful, sometimes we get those things confused. So let me go to the bottom portion of what Dr. Johnson was talking about. What we do know is that children tend to do better when both their fathers and mothers are engaged in the lives of their children. And I think one of the primary challenges for child development in terms of the nurturing role is that because non-resident fatherhood is so common among African American men, that African American men are less likely to be exposed to what it takes to raise a child from the cradle to the from the cradle until the children are adults. Because they are not residing with their children, they don't experience what feeding a child is, the difficulties that are associated with the changes that mothers experience during the period in which they are pregnant. They don't experience what childbirth is all about. And as a result, the information that they have in order to weigh in and be part of a nurturing role, that information is coming entirely from sort of the sporadic interactions that they are having during the pregnancy, during the birth, and thereafter. And it is entirely dependent upon what the mother and the family that is surrounding the mother, what they permit the father to see and do.
Right.
And if that goes well, then the fathers can be engaged and make a contribution. If it doesn't, then the father's ability to, first of all, know what it is that he should be doing and how he should be supporting the birth and the early childhood development can be compromised to the detriment of both the father, the mother, and the child. And so, I think while this idea of the provider role is a norm that has never been applicable, at least in the American experience, I worry that our rejection of marriage as a norm is problematic. Our rejection of mothers and fathers living under the same roof so that fathers have an opportunity to understand what that full experience is about. That's a norm in the larger society that is my own belief that we reject to our detriment. And so this is a complicated story, and how we work this out has been an important part of my work. But I think in general, it's an important part of the work that we all have to do as Black people.
Thank you. Thank you very much, both of you. So I heard a number of really key points. I heard the pivoting away from provider protector as roles that fathers play separately and mothers play separately, and instead rethinking it more as taking a child-centered approach, a developmental approach, so that now you have two people, two adults, two parents, regardless of residency, both contributing to the development and nurturing and support of a child. I also heard in Dr. Mincy's comments challenging that norm of co-parenting. And I think we're hearing a little bit more about co-parenting in the literature, especially among non-resident Black fathers and non-resident Black families. But I also heard the overlay of that gatekeeping experience where the mother very often is playing that role of running interference between the biological father and the child, or access to the child and the biological father. And sometimes grandmother and other family members also run interference for that. So a number of these different key pieces coming into play, making that idea of rethinking or reimagining what protector and provider looks like a little bit more complicated. But I'm going to throw in an additional piece to further complicate it and add some nuance to that conversation. Dr. Mincy, I know that we heard you talk about child support payments and the financial contribution and your work on some of that. And I know that you've been one of the leading voices on how we should be thinking, and in some cases rethinking, fathers' contributions beyond the financial. How does the nurturing role, that is the emotional, social, vulnerability support, how does that feature for Black fathers as we rethink what it means to be a provider and protector?
As an example, I want to think about an experiment, a trial experience that's going on in New York around non-resident fathers. One of the things that New York is doing is, if for fathers who have substance abuse problems, first of all, so before I start there, let me back up. One of the challenges that the child support apparatus faces and African American fathers face as a consequence of this is that our child support law is a derivation of what used to be called bastard law in the colonial period. And that gives you a sense of where the system that we have now, what its origins were. That is to say, to have a child out of wedlock in the first place was sort of a violation of the norms of society, which is why child support law was called bastard law. And then only as a society evolved, we came to the position that children who were born to unmarried parents, in some sense, had the same rights or should have the same rights as children who were born to married parents. And the system has tried to sort of move to that position. But our child support enforcement policies basically are making the following assumption: that parents came together, they married, they divorced, the father left and took his money with him. And the role of the child support enforcement system is to get the money back, right? Those are a set of fundamental assumptions that are inapplicable to so many African-American families. In the first place, rates of non-marital birth have been in the range of 70 to 67 to 70% for decades, right? Often because early sexual debut, especially among African-American men. So the notion that parents come together and have the capability, right, the maturity to be parents in the first place, and then when you observe a mother and father living under different households, which is the occasion for child support, that the role of child support enforcement policy is, first of all, he left and took his money with him, and the role of child support is to get it back. Those are not the set of operating assumptions that come into play for so many African-American families. Instead, it's more like both mother and father. Now, again, and what I really am talking about is children who are in the child support enforcement system, right? Versus the wide diversity of African-American families by socioeconomic status and education, et cetera. Some of what I'm about to say is less applicable to African-American people who are highly educated, stably employed, et cetera. I want to think about the proportion of the population where those assumptions are not true. Then so many young African-American people have children less than 24 years old. They are not college graduates, right? And therefore they come together, have children out of wedlock before they are mature enough to fully understand the responsibilities of parenting. Right. Both mother and father may be economically disadvantaged, right? And therefore you take two essentially poor young adults, right? And when they come together and have a child, they become a poor family. And the idea that when they break up, the role of public policy should be to get the money back from them is inapplicable, because he is as likely to have been from a poor background as she was. And then public policy says, okay, we have a mother and child, and what we are trying to do is to make the circumstance of the child undistinguished from what it would have been if the parents ever broke up. That's why the idea is go after the father and get the money. But if the father doesn't have the money in the first place, it's like the proverbial, trying to squeeze blood out of a turnip. And that's the child support enforcement policy that is defined by the larger society, which works well for white women in the 1970s and thereafter, but it does not work well for lots of African-American families that are caught up in the child support enforcement system. And so, in addition to that, you add a couple of layers, which is that if you're stably employed, we can go to your employer, we can identify your income, we can automatically intercept your child support payments, and you are good to go. Right. On the other, that is you can retrieve child support payments from fathers using basically what is called the automatic payment of child support, because employers are required to provide that information, and your child support payments can be deducted from your paycheck in the same way your Social Security taxes are deducted. If your employment is unstable, and if your housing is unstable, that automatic withholding system is not operating, right? That is, that you may be employed by one employer this month and another employer next month. And so when child support reaches out to your employer from last month, you're no longer there, right? And as a result, you have a child support order that is in play. That child support order is not paid. And as a result, you accumulate arrears over time. And so there are lots of ways in which the underlying assumptions about the way in which we enforce child support are inapplicable to Black families, which is why you have so many men of color who are in the child support enforcement system. They have arrears between $10,000 and $20,000, and their arrears continue to grow under time. And the last thing I will say is, again, the role of mass incarceration. Mass incarceration, which was a phenomenon of but in 1983. We knew that a third of African American men under 30 years old would be ever incarcerated. So this is a process that has been going on for decades. Right. The Clinton administration's reforms ramped it up substantially, but we have had, several cohorts of Black men who have been caught up in the criminal justice system. And when you're in that system, we do not have a process wherein if you are between the time you are arrested and the time you are incarcerated, your child support obligations are automatically processed. You have lots of things going on, including getting an attorney, figuring out, whether you're guilty or not. There are a lot of things going on in your life at the point at which you're incarcerated. However, child support enforcement may not be your highest priority, but by the time you get out and you have $30,000, $40,000 in debt, child support debt, that can become a barrier to your reentering into society. So again, this is, in my view, a function of a child support enforcement system that has been designed to meet the needs of white families that have now caught up thousands of African American men for several generations, and that system needs to be, and fortunately is, very slowly changing to the better.
So at the beginning we talked about how this pivot away from just the financial provision to also thinking about it more from the sense of the child-centered approach, the developmental understanding of fathers nurturing, the importance of fathers nurturing, the importance of parenting to children, the importance of co-parenting to children. And so you laid a really rich historical context for understanding the significant inequities and inequalities and oppression that's part of that system, that financial system. I think you also kind of laid the foundation for understanding some of the stresses that fathers who are in those spaces, thinking of having a $20,000 tag attached to you, knowing that you're starting off behind the start, like way behind, not having any money to your name, not having any financial resources to your name, but having a significant financial debt and the stress that brings.
I think one of the things that we can do, the child support system has wrestled with, again, for decades, trying to acknowledge the informal contributions that fathers make to their children. And sometimes these are informal payments that are not in the formal child support enforcement system, but they could also be contributions that men make to children's well-being that don't have to do with cash. So the whole dialogue around co-parenting is leading to a set of interventions where child development researchers are engaging fathers in children, in learning, in children acquiring their early language skills, so that they learn that the dots on the page, represent letters, that when we read, we turn the page from this way to that, that when parents hold their infants and teach them how to read, in addition, and teach them and read the newspaper, even though the children have no idea at that juncture what is going on, they're also bonding with their children, and they're facilitating their children's early language skills, which are a key to their math skills, etc. We could honor the in-kind contributions that non-resident fathers are making by learning how to read to their children, because when children are between, the neuroscience is telling us that when children are between 0 and 3 years old, they have an enormous capacity at that point in their development that's going to affect the rest of their life course. And if we engage non-resident fathers in sort of developing that neurological capacity, the present discounted value of the contributions those fathers are making to their children when they're infants far exceed any child support that they would ever be able to pay, right? And so among the things that we can do is take the technologies that are being developed in order to engage resident fathers in children's learning and engage non-resident fathers in that process, and then figure out a way to allow them to meet their child support obligations as a consequence of their engagement in their children's development. And there is a lot to learn. And again, part of the issue here is that, again, if African-American families have their children so young, so what do you do when you take someone who is between 19 and 23 years old, and you're trying, and that man is trying to help teach his child to read, and the child doesn't want to read at that point, right? The child is interested in doing something else, right? And what the father has to be taught to understand is often we have to allow children to lead in our interactions with them. And as we are, so I learned this stuff in part because I know nothing about this. I learned all about this from watching my sons engage with my grandchildren. And one of the things my older son always does when my granddaughter was young is that when he talked to her, he would bend down so that he would meet her at the same eye level. And he read to her in her womb. In her mother's womb, and as a consequence, my granddaughter has such an enormous set of cognitive skills because he was actively engaged in her intellectual development from the time she was born until now and beyond that. And the same thing with my younger son and his son. And so again, there are very important financial contributions that fathers can make to children's well-being, but they have to be taught how to interact with children and engaged in parenting programs in the same way mothers are taught. And if they are allowed to do so, and we can represent those, I'm an economist, I can figure out how to monetize that. We can then count that against the child support obligations that they have, and then diminish the amount of debt that they have, but radically improve the arc of their children's educational attainment, of their children's likelihood of going to college, of their children's future earnings, and get what society wants out of it, which is that parents ought to be engaged in the responsibilities of raising a child, and they ought not to be let off scot-free, so that society doesn't have the responsibility of caring for the kids. Dr. Johnson, I apologize for dominating this part of the conversation, but what I'm concerned about is that the research that is working on engaging fathers in children's development is targeting fathers who are resident. Yep. Right. And I understand why it is so. You have developmental psychologists who are doing these interventions, and the last thing they want to deal with is when they make the appointment for the mother and father to be in a joint reading session, and the father doesn't show up, right? Then they have limited amounts of grant money. The graduate students have showed up, and this is all falling apart. However, this is a consequence of the research not understanding how Black families function, right? Non-resident fathers are as likely, I have this paper that we're finishing where we show that non-resident fathers who never resided with the mothers of their children and their children are as likely to visit their children as are cohabiting fathers who subsequently break up. So there are ways in which you can engage unmarried parents in the lives of their kids. The skills that they learn while they're romantically involved about visitation can be transferred after their romantic relationships break up. And so we have a common stake in this child who we gave birth to, and there are ways in which public policy can figure out how to facilitate that engagement. They're doing this in child support courts in Minnesota and other places around the country, and we can learn from that experience in order to A, get us out of this child support trap, but B, in order to, again, improve the literacy skills, cognitive development, and educational trajectory of Black children, and solve a lot of these problems at the same time.
So, Dr. Johnson, I'm going to pivot over to you. So I think a lot of what Dr. Mincy was talking about, we're seeing some of it beginning to emerge as we see some of these early, I think they're called the first 5 initiatives. And I've heard of a number of them. In fact, there's one right here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the School of Human Ecology. We have a first 5 initiative that is very interested in those first few years of life for kids. And I know of a number of other locations across the country that have these first 5 initiatives. And I think from what Dr. Mincy was talking about, one of the limitations for a lot of these ones, especially in the university settings, is that they're often not reaching these populations that we're talking about. So Black and or low income, non-resident families, often these initiatives, unless they're directly catering to those populations, they're not reaching out, or they're not able to attract those populations into their services. But the importance of having those services, I don't know if you could speak to that, Dr. Johnson, the importance of having fathers in those nurturing spaces.
Yeah.
Alvin, can I stop you a minute? I have something burning on the stove. And
Okay.
I'm going to come right back.
All right, go ahead.
So I think an important thing for us to keep in mind, and by us I mean just people in general, not necessarily just us on this conversation, is that Black fathers are engaged in nurturing relationships within their families. And part of our limitation is that as researchers, we haven't fully pursued studying all the various ways that it's happening, and thinking through how it happens across men's life course, how it happens across children's life courses, and the various ways it can happen depending on the father's relationships with their partners, their children, and extended family members. And we also just have limited information about when fathers are solo parents themselves. And so, but when we have studied this, what we see is that Black fathers are often more engaged around certain nurturing, caregiving activities than men of other races. We also see that family members, I can say from my own work of studying the narratives young adult daughters have about their relationships with their fathers, that whether their fathers are resident or non-resident, they're really attuned to their father's contributions beyond providing financial resources and protection. And they talked about the father's extension of affection, being role models, providing feedback about different life events. And I think when we look deeply at what that information provides us, what we see is that fathers are engaged not only with their biological children, but with children of their partners, with nieces and nephews, with grandchildren, right? So you'll find men who perhaps weren't as engaged with their own children in their youth, but who become active uncles or grandfathers. And so I think it's important to have even an expanded way of thinking about fatherhood and how men can parent across their life course and with different children. And you could find a father whose biological children may feel that they weren't as engaged in nurturing roles, but whose nieces and nephews or whose grandchildren may found them to be the most important father figures in their lives. And so when we're thinking and talking about nurturing roles, it's important to highlight the emotional aspect, the social aspect, and how it can change over time, even for one individual or within families. And related to that, I think it's important to also think about how within the racial context, the racialized context of the United States, Black fathers do a lot of work nurturing their children's racial socialization and how they respond to racism in society. The Black fathers do a lot of work conveying kind of cultural values, ways of protecting children, ways for children to protect themselves within certain spaces. And so there's a lot of rich data there that I think we're just beginning to really explore. And I think, I know as part of this effort, fathers themselves are going to be watching this video. And so one of the messages I want them to think about is that they may already be doing some things. And so it's important to think about what they're doing and then also expand on that with the focus on, well, what do children need emotionally, socially? And as it relates to vulnerability and the nurturing role, there are some, I think, limitations that are connected to policies, like Dr. Mincy mentioned, that can make it difficult for fathers to be vulnerable and engaged with their families, right? If they have a large sum of arrears, they could face some gatekeeping from whoever has primary custody of the child. And so there's ways policies, the structures of child support policies increase kind of limitations and access that fathers have to their children. And also, when we think about vulnerability and nurturing, there are these family expectations. So even in the work I've done examining the perspectives of fathers, but also the perspectives of daughters, these expectations around masculinity and strength of men can sometimes hamper how they feel that they can express nurturing and vulnerability within families, the ways that they may talk about their experiences with interpersonal violence within community spaces, or the ways that they may talk about their feelings or hurt related to not engaging their children. And so there's important policy pieces, important practice pieces in terms of schools, fatherhood programs, and health establishments and how they engage fathers. And then there's important family parts, pieces to this, in which families have to take more expanded ideas of vulnerability for Black men and allow that space for them to engage in nurturing ways with families that extend beyond playing sports.
Yeah. So in another conversation in part of this series, we talked about that intersecting role, or the intersecting identities of the roles for fathers. So we talk about the identity, the masculine identity, talk about the Black identity and the overlay of the identity of a parent, those three intersecting identities, and how it influences fathering, and how it influences how Black men think of themselves as fathers and think of themselves as men and think of themselves as Black. As we think of these multiple roles, and we think of also that role of protector and provider. So think of all of those historical pieces that yourself and Dr. Mincy have talked about, and then thinking about some of those nurturing pieces that you just talked about, Dr. Johnson, and then now think also of the overlay, so further nuanced overlay of all of these other social identities. How do those things, essentially, what roles do fathers' beliefs and attitudes? So thinking about all of that, what role does the father's belief or attitudes play in fulfilling the role of protector and provider? And what are some of the common misconceptions that you think arise as you discuss fatherhood with Black men? I know it was a compound question there. So let's maybe first talk about the beliefs and attitudes of Black fathers in fulfilling that protector provider role. What are some of those beliefs that you're hearing from Black fathers, or that you're seeing in the research?
We've talked about this a bit earlier in the conversation, that even as Black families may practice different family roles differently than societal expectations, Black families still also endorse some of those roles. Like, so some of those roles may be goals for some people, and I do think that sometimes those having those expectations can be limiting for families. I think it's important to kind of take the context of where they are and say, well, how can we create the healthiest form of engagement based on the family as it exists? I also think when we have these traditional conceptualizations, we leave out certain types of families, right? And certain types of fathers. So there are gay Black men who parent their sister's children, right? Their uncles who attempt to have custody of and adopt their children, right? And when we have traditional conceptualizations of the father and protector in those roles, we may leave out various sexualities, various gender identities that may be important for the type of fathering that's happening, and important for thinking through policy ways of how to engage and practice ways of engaging Black fathers of various social identities. I'll stop there and then I'll be happy to jump back in.
One of the things that I think about in terms of these multiple identities is that, I tend to worry a great deal about fathers when they're young, and because they're having young children, and because again the capacities of child development are so critical at that stage, right. And I am concerned that in fathers' conceptualizations of their roles, their multiple roles, they're focused on the present and they're not looking at the long haul. And as a grandfather, I am now, and so a couple of things. So let's just talk about the role of authority. Okay. Somehow a light bulb went off for me when my sons were preteens, that I had to move from a role in which I commanded them to do things to a role in which they would seek me out for advice. Right. And how was I going to negotiate that? And I wish I wasn't an economist and I was a psychologist so I could describe it, but it did occur to me, right? And I began to work with them in such a way that they would come to me, and I began to try to be a better listener. My wife helped me a great deal with that, so that as they got older, and I was no longer in the position to require them to do things, but they needed me, they would seek me out for advice. And I began to do that before the time occurred, so that once they got there, they would seek me out and I would continue to be engaged in their lives. I think the other thing that young men need to think about is, when you're looking at a little 3-year-old, at some point that child is going to be 13 really fast, right? And they're going to be 30 before you know it. And so the role is, the idea is that your potential to make a contribution to your children's life is ongoing, right? Yeah. Particularly because of and so I slip to another role in terms of this provider role. I think the health consequences of the way African American men, their work requirements, the food that we tend to consume, it means that our mortality rates are going to be very, very low, right? What are we going to do? My sons are 40 and 50 years old, right? I want to be available to them when they're older still. That's not going to happen unless I take care of myself. And so I think, again, particularly for young men, you have to be looking at the long haul. And you also have to be looking at, it seems to me, transitions in the roles, right? Because as children get older and adults get older, what is the phrase? What is it? Once a child, I'm going to mess it up, right? But twice a child, right? Those roles transition.
Once a man, twice a child.
Right. Those roles transition. And at some juncture, your children begin to take care of you, and you need to embrace that. So I recall when I was, I'm a cancer survivor, and my granddaughter, when she was a little girl, I was recovering from cancer in 2008. And I wasn't able to, we would come over together and my family would go out and hang out, but I wasn't able to go out with them. Right. And so it was Christmas time, and my wife and my sons took her to this huge toy store, and she stopped because she wanted to buy a one of those gadgets that you use to pick up things because I had limited mobility. She wanted to buy that for me before she bought stuff for herself. And I think men need to embrace the fact that this provider caregiver role is going to transition, and you want to encourage that transition, right? So that, at some point, I have this phrase in the back of my mind that says there are too many Black men who are always vulnerable, but all of us will be vulnerable at some point. Okay, I don't have the same capacities as someone who's 69 as I had when I was 39, right? But I want my children to be in a position to take care of me and for me to respond to their demands upon me to take care of myself in the same way I expect that role to be reversed when they were younger. And so again, as we're working with men around their roles as fathers, there's a set of mutual obligations and mutual responsibilities, and those things will change over time, right? At this point, I find myself, I have my son look me eyeball to eyeball and say, Dad, I know when when the whole brouhaha around vaccinations was occurring, right? And I live in New York City, and I was concerned, my goodness, the last thing I want to do is to get on a long line waiting for a vaccine, right? And so I'm going to wait till the drama sorts itself out, and then I'll get a vaccine. And my son said, Dad, I know that when you want to get something done, you can get it done. Go and get the vaccine. and what I heard was my own voice, right? And so if I was once able to direct him in that way, he had the right to direct me in that way. I got up, I took care of it, I got a vaccine, and then the whole family was able to be together, and we were all safe. But so again, in the long and short of it, these multiple roles have to take into account the long-term relationships between fathers, their children, and their families. And so you are at one place now in that life cycle, you will be at a different place, and you want to be doing the things today that will enable you to be there in the future because they'll need you throughout.
I like you mentioned the long haul of these responsibilities. And then you also, I think earlier both of you talked about these younger fathers. And I think Dr. Mincy, you talked about some of the limitations of these younger fathers, economic, educational, and other kinds of resources that they have limitations for. And I think as I kind of pair that long haul view of parenting, of fatherhood, and the limitations that come with young fatherhood, of becoming a father very young, especially for Black men, I start to wonder how feasible is it to expect these 20-something-year-old fathers, teen fathers, without appropriate intervention, to be able to appreciate that long haul nature of fathering, when we know from the research that at 26, these brains are still developing, and there's still that feeling of invincibility. There's still that egocentric nature to how people see themselves at these ages. And so how do we make sense of those two disparate realities, that there's this long haul nature that we need to, or this long haul perspective that we need to take to understanding our role as Black fathers, or understanding the role of Black fathers. But you have so many Black fathers, just based on developmental stage, who may not be at the place where they can appreciate those intricate responsibilities, intricate realities, and what that means, not just for them, but for their families and for their children. So I think just together, all these pieces come in, create this really interesting conundrum. But I wanted to ask one other question, kind of pushing us to in a different direction. As we think about the literature on Black fathers and their behaviors, we know that it doesn't highlight as much the structural barriers that affect fathering. I'm curious though about what the role does, what role does, we talked about the role of fathers' beliefs and attitudes. We talked about fathers' age. We talked about all the different challenges that fathers have. I want to think of, as we draw this to a close, what are some potential takeaway points, maybe some practical advice that you might have to offer to fathers who are listening to this podcast? And maybe we can start with you first, Dr. Johnson, and we can jump back to Dr. Mincy.
A great question. And also I had a follow-up point on what you said about developmentally, what young fathers are able to do. And I don't have a firm research answer to that, but I do know from research that young fathers do think deeply about their relationships with their fathers and older men in their lives. And so for people who are practitioners who are thinking about how to get young men to think of the long haul, having them to reflect on their own experiences with older men in their lives and their what they got that they liked and what they wish was better may be a starting point for getting them to think through their own trajectories with their families. In terms of takeaways for people, one major takeaway that I want people who see this to have is that Black fathers are thoughtful and engaged in thinking about how to parent, and they are often engaged in ways that are beyond what stereotypes and social anecdotal kind of evidence says. And the important piece related to that is that for Black fathers themselves to build on the activities they're already doing and to really focus on what helps increase the safety, security, and well-being for their children. So whether they're resident or outside of the household, whether they're the legal guardians of the children or social fathers who are engaged, really centering and focusing on what's best for the child, and even what do they need to do for their own individual health in order to provide the best set of resources and availability and nurturing for their children.
So thank you very much.
So and I entirely support one of the things that we know is that African American fathers, even if they're non-resident, are much more likely to be engaged in the lives of their children after they break up with the mothers of the children than our white fathers who are divorced or white fathers who are cohabiting and break up. So and that is indicative that there's something different going on in the chemistry of Black families. So and therefore the opportunities to engage are there. The question really is, how do you engage? And Dr. Johnson continues to repeat the phrase, what do children need, right? And that has to do with, again, their cognitive skills and the development of their, even if I can't read very well, I can surely read better than this infant, right? And understanding that the activity of engaging in reading to a child has really, really dramatic effects on that child's development. So there are contributions that I can make now, and that child's literacy skills may eclipse mine within 10 years. It doesn't matter, right? The contribution that I can make now will be very important for the future. I think the thing that we haven't said, and it's like the elephant in the room, is for good or ill, my capacity to be engaged in my child's life at 13 much depends on the relationship with the mother of my child throughout. And therefore, we really do have to figure out how to help African American parents, how to secure their relationships while they're romantically involved, and how to help them continue to process their joint commitment to their children if their romantic involvement dissipates. Okay. And part of that, I think the work that was done in the early 1990s around healthy marriages was not crazy. Okay. Because the longer parents remain married, the easier it is for fathers to have access to their children. And if they break up, how do you co-parent? Okay, and as I've said before, I am really concerned that much of this co-parenting conversation is happening among cohabiting couples because it presumes that non-resident parents are no longer together in some way. And I think that's just a false, and it really, I don't want to flip the switch. there is where the opportunities for younger researchers lies, right? Because you have large numbers of African-American parents who are non-resident. And then the question is, how do you facilitate their co-parenting even after their romantic involvement is done? And so there are opportunities then through research. This whole conversation around the social determinants of health provides spaces to visit that area. And I would encourage not only the fathers themselves, but those of us, again, my younger colleagues who are doing research in this area. There is where the gold is, right? In terms of improving the relationships among African-American parents who may be unmarried and who may no longer be cohabiting. How do they remain co-conspirators in the well-being of their children? And if we get that done, I think we can exploit some of the engagement that is already occurring, but is untrained. And what we need to do is, again, facilitate, especially for fathers, how do you interact with children? How do you understand that when you're reading to a child or when you're working with a child and the child's attention is somewhere else, switch gears, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you're able to do more of what the child's doing, you're bonding. Even if the thing that you thought you wanted to accomplish isn't happening, the bonding is still occurring, and therefore you can move on to. And how do you teach fathers how to have the patience to endure that, etc., so that they can build positive relationships with their children and stay engaged? That's work that needs to be done.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Mincy. So what I hear at the end of all of this is that we're pivoting this provider-protector role more towards a child-centered approach. What is it my child needs? What can I provide for my child? How can I support my child? And we're pivoting away from, even if we continue to support them financially, we have to think of ways we can support them emotionally and otherwise. And that can sometimes mean something as simple as child-directed play, like Dr. Mincy was just suggesting. Let your child's behavior decide where what that activity is going to look like. Reading to your child, even if your reading skills may not be on par, I think Dr. Mincy's words were, you can read better than an infant. So read to your child and talk to your child. You're watching a game, talk to your child about the game. Tell your child what's going on TV as you're watching that game with them, as you're listening to that game with them. You're listening to this podcast, talk to your child about what's going on on this podcast. That encourages neurodevelopment. It encourages their brain's development. So all of those are really interesting things that fathers can be engaged in, can do. Recognize the long haul nature of your role as a Black father, that it's not just for now, it's going to be for the next God knows how many years you and your child are going to have that relationship. But I think, Dr. Mincy, you hinted at that co-parenting relationship. That's actually another conversation that we're going to have as part of this series. So those of you who are watching this podcast, listening to this podcast, we have two other conversations that are specifically going to be discussing the co-parenting relationship, co-parenting as a team, and what that looks like for Black families. So thank you again to Dr. Ronald Mincy and Dr. Maria Johnson for joining us. We really appreciated your time, your experience, and your expertise. Thank you very much for watching, and have a great, great day. Thank you for listening to the Black Fatherhood Podcast with Dr. Alvin Thomas. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends on social media or post a review online. Thanks again for being part of the conversation.